The Case Vault, File 001, The Tylenol Murders. Part 1, The Unseen Terror. Trust is a fragile, invisible thread. It is the silent contract we sign with civilization every single morning. When you turn the faucet, you trust the water is pure. When you step onto an elevator, you trust the cables will hold. And in the year 1982, when an American reached into a medicine cabinet for a bottle of Tylenol, they weren't just taking a pill. They were performing an act of absolute, unwavering faith. At the dawn of the 1980s, Tylenol wasn't just a product. It was a cultural pillar. It was the gold standard of pain relief. A billion-dollar crown jewel in the empire of Johnson & Johnson. It had successfully pushed aspirin off the throne, promising a future of relief without the stomach irritation of the past. It was in nearly 40% of all American households. It was the brand parents gave to their children. It was the bottle that sat on the nightstands of grandmothers and the desks of CEOs. It was the ultimate symbol of domestic safety. But in the final days of September 1982, in the quiet, manicured suburbs of Chicago, that safety was being methodically, surgically, dismantled. Somewhere in the sprawling gray landscape of the Midwest, a shadow was moving through the fluorescent lit aisles of grocery stores and pharmacies. This wasn't a common thief. They weren't interested in the register or the narcotics behind the counter. They were interested in the most mundane object imaginable. This predator understood a terrifying truth. You don't need a high-powered rifle or a complex bomb to paralyze a nation. You only need to understand the habits of your victims. You only need to know what they trust. This killer chose a weapon that was already inside our homes. They chose a delivery system that was invited in through the front door. They didn't have to break into your house. You brought them in yourself. Welcome to the Case Vault HQ. Today, we are unlocking the most definitive archive on the 1982 Tylenol murders. This is not just a retelling of a crime. This is a deep dive investigation into the day the American dream was poisoned. To understand the weight of what happened, we have to travel back to a Chicago that no longer exists. 1982 was a world before the digital veil. There were no smartphones to ping us with breaking news alerts. There was no social media to spread warnings in seconds. Information was a physical thing. It came in the morning paper, the 6 p.m. news, or a frantic phone call from a neighbor. The suburbs of Elk Grove Village, Arlington Heights, and Winfield were the promised land. These were the places people moved to when they wanted to raise their children away from the perceived chaos of the city. These were neighborhoods of brick houses, green lawns, and unlocked back doors. If you lived here in 1982, your biggest concerns were the rising interest rates or the local high school football rankings. It was a world governed by the gold standard of consumer trust. In 1982, Tylenol had recently introduced the extra-strength capsule. It was a marvel of pharmaceutical marketing. A two-piece gelatin shell, red and white, filled with a fine white powder. It looked modern. It looked professional. But more importantly, it was easy to swallow. And, as a killer would soon prove, it was fatally easy to manipulate. We now know, through decades of FBI profiling and forensic reconstruction, that in the days leading up to Wednesday, September 29 a monster was walking these very streets. They weren't hiding in an alleyway. They were walking into Jewel-Osco supermarkets. They were browsing the shelves of local Walgreens. They were dressed like you and me. They would pick up a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, perhaps a 50-count bottle, and they would walk out with it. Back at a hidden location, a kitchen table, a basement workbench, a hotel room. They began their grim work. They didn't need a laboratory. They only needed a steady hand. They pulled the gelatin capsules apart. They emptied the acetaminophen. and they replaced it. They used potassium cyanide, a chemical so potent that a dose the size of a grain of salt can kill a grown man in minutes. It works by preventing the body's cells from using oxygen. It is, quite literally, internal suffocation. Once the capsules were reassembled, the killer did the unthinkable. They drove back to the stores. They walked back down the aisles they had walked days before. And they placed the bottles back on the front of the shelves. They weren't just committing murder. They were setting a trap and stepping back to watch the world step into it. They were playing a game of chemical Russian roulette with an entire population. And as the sun rose on Wednesday, September 29 the first victims were already reaching for their medicine cabinets. It was 6:30 a.m. in Elk Grove Village. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up with a minor sore throat and a runny nose. It was the quintessential autumn cold, the kind of thing that usually meant a day at home, on the couch, with a blanket and a bowl of soup. Her parents, Dennis and Gina Kellerman, were the picture of suburban stability. Dennis, a man who worked hard to provide for his family, saw his daughter was unwell. He did what any father would do in 1982. He went to the kitchen, opened a fresh bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, and gave Mary a single capsule. "Take this, honey," he likely said. "It'll make you feel better." Mary swallowed the pill with a sip of water. She walked into the bathroom to wash her face and get back into her pajamas. Dennis Kellerman would later recount the moment his world fractured. He heard a sound. Not a scream. Not a cry for help. Just a dull, heavy thud against the bathroom door. He called out her name. No answer. When he forced the door open, he found his 12-year-old daughter collapsed on the floor. Her breathing was irregular. A terrifying, rasping sound. Her eyes were fixed. Her body rigid. Paramedics arrived within minutes. But the girl they carried out of that house on a stretcher was already gone. At the hospital, the confusion was total. Doctors looked at this vibrant, healthy young girl and saw a body that had simply failed. They checked for a sudden stroke. They checked for an undiagnosed heart defect. They looked for meningitis. As Mary Kellerman was pronounced dead at 9:24 a.m., the medical examiner's initial thought was possible stroke. It was a medical anomaly. A tragedy. A fluke. No one thought it was a murder. Not yet. While the Kellerman family sat in a sterile hospital waiting room, paralyzed by a grief they couldn't name, 5 miles away in Arlington Heights, the Janus family was starting their day. They didn't know the Kellermans. They had no connection to Elk Grove Village. But their fates were about to be fused together in a nightmare that would rewrite American history. Adam Janus was 27 years old. A postal worker. A man of routine and health. Around midday, he felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest and a crushing pressure in his head. He figured he was coming down with whatever was going around. He went to his kitchen. He opened a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol he had purchased just a few days prior at a local Jewel-Osco. He took the recommended dose. Within minutes, Adam Janus was on the floor. He was rushed to the emergency room at Northwest Community Hospital. Ironically, it was the same hospital where Mary Kellerman's body was still being processed. By mid-afternoon, Adam Janus was pronounced dead. The doctors again suspected a massive, sudden heart attack. The news of Adam's death hit the family like a physical blow. His brother, Stanley Janus, and Stanley's young wife, Teresa, just 19 years old, rushed to Adam's house to console his grieving widow. The house was a scene of chaos and sorrow. Friends and family were coming in and out. The air was thick with shock. The stress was manifesting physically. Stanley and Teresa both complained of pounding headaches. They were in Adam's kitchen, the very place where he had collapsed just hours earlier. They saw the bottle of Tylenol sitting on the counter. In a moment of tragic, crushing irony, they reached for the same bottle. Stanley took a pill. Teresa took a pill. Stanley Janus fell to the floor before he could even finish the glass of water. Teresa, seeing her husband collapse, reached out to him, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Before her own nervous system was short-circuited by the poison, 2 more ambulances arrived at the Janus home. The paramedics were the same ones who had picked up Adam earlier that day. They were now witnessing a scene that defied reality. 3 members of the same family, all young, all healthy, dead or dying, in the same house within 6 hours. They thought the house was poisoned. They suspected carbon monoxide. They suspected a gas leak. They ordered everyone out of the building. But as the sun began to set over the Chicago suburbs, the body count stood at 4. And the public was still entirely unaware that the most dangerous place in America was the medicine cabinet. As Wednesday, September 29th came to a close, 4 lives had been extinguished by an invisible hand. The police were baffled. The hospitals were overflowing with fear. And the killer? The killer was somewhere out there. Perhaps sitting in a quiet apartment. Perhaps driving through the very streets where the ambulances were racing. Watching. Waiting. Waiting for the moment the world realized that the trust was gone. We have reached the end of Section 1. But the investigation is only just beginning. If you have watched this far, you are now part of the investigation. We are on a journey to unlock every detail of this case. And we need your help to hit our goals. Subscribe to Case Vault HQ right now. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss out. Share this video with someone who needs to hear the truth about the day America lost its innocence. In Section 2, we reveal the breakthrough. The moment 2 off-duty firefighters realized the common thread. And the horrifying discovery of the bitter almond scent. That changed everything. The vault is open. Stay with us. Part 2, The Scent of Bitter Almonds. By the late afternoon of September 29, 1982, the emergency rooms of Chicago's northwest suburbs were transformed into a theater of the absurd. Doctors are trained to look for patterns. They look for symptoms that lead to a diagnosis. But what they were seeing in these early hours defied every textbook in the medical archive. You had a 12-year-old girl in Elk Grove Village, a 27-year-old postal worker in Arlington Heights, and now, his brother and sister-in-law, all collapsing with the same violent, systemic failure. At Northwest Community Hospital, the staff was working in a state of quiet, professional panic. They were looking for a virus. They were looking for a localized outbreak of some rare, aggressive strain of flu. They were even looking for environmental toxins. Checking the hospital's own air filtration systems. They were looking for a ghost. But while the medical community was blinded by the search for a disease, 2 men were about to see the truth. They weren't doctors. They weren't scientists. They were firefighters. Philip Capitelli and Richard Keyworth were off duty that day. Like many first responders, they spent their downtime listening to the rhythm of the city through their police scanners. They had heard the call for the Kellerman girl, then the call for Adam Janus, then the secondary call for Stanley and Teresa. To the average listener, these were just tragic coincidences in a large metropolitan area. But Capitelli and Keyworth noticed something. The locations were too close. The symptoms, the sudden collapse, the respiratory distress, the immediate death, they were identical. They did something that in 1982 was a stroke of investigative genius. They started calling the hospitals. They started asking the nurses what was on the nightstand, what was in the kitchen, and in every single location. The answer came back the same: a red and white bottle of extra strength Tylenol. It was around 8:00 p.m. when the investigators finally secured the bottles from the Janus household. They brought them to the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. The atmosphere in that lab was thick with tension. Dr. Edmund Donahue, the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner, was a man who had seen every way a human life could end. But even he was not prepared for what happened when they opened that bottle. As the cap was twisted off, a faint, distinct odor wafted into the room. It didn't smell like medicine. It didn't smell like the chalky, sterile scent of acetaminophen. It smelled like bitter almonds. To a layman, that might sound pleasant. To a toxicologist, it is the smell of a death sentence. Cyanide, Donahue whispered. Potassium cyanide is a chemical that kills by treachery. It enters the bloodstream and latches onto the cytochrome oxidase in your cells. It essentially locks the door. It tells your cells you cannot use the oxygen in your blood. You can breathe in all the air in the world, but your body can't use it. You suffocate from the inside out, while your lungs are full of air. The team in the lab performed a crude but effective test. They took one of the Tylenol capsules and emptied the contents into a beaker of water. They added a chemical reagent. The water didn't just change color. It turned a deep, bruised, purple-black. One of the lab technicians later remarked that there was enough cyanide in a single capsule to kill an entire family. The killer hadn't just spiked the medicine. They had packed it. They had compressed the poison into the gelatin shells so tightly that it was a miracle the capsules didn't burst on the shelf. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. This wasn't a medical anomaly. This wasn't a gas leak. This was mass murder. And the weapon was currently sitting in millions of homes across the United States. Now, imagine the logistical nightmare facing the Chicago Police Department and the FBI. It is 10:00 p.m. on a Wednesday night. You have just confirmed that the most popular pain reliever in America is a delivery system for one of the world's deadliest poisons. You don't know how many bottles are tainted. You don't know which stores are compromised. All you know is that tomorrow morning, millions of people are going to wake up and reach for a pill. What followed was one of the most frantic public safety mobilizations in American history. Police officers were dispatched to every suburb. They weren't hunting a suspect. They were hunting a product. They drove through residential neighborhoods with their loudspeakers blaring. waking families from their sleep, shouting into the night, "Discard your Tylenol. Do not take Tylenol." In the early morning hours of September 30th, the news broke on every major network. "We have a crisis," the news anchor said, their voices tight with the weight of the headline. The panic was visceral. In 1982, the supermarket was the center of the American community. Now, it was a minefield. People began to flood the emergency rooms, not because they were sick, but because they had taken a Tylenol 3 days ago, and were now convinced they were dying. The psychosomatic toll was nearly as large as the physical one. At the Jewel-Osco in Arlington Heights, where Adam Janus had bought his bottle, the manager stood in the aisle, watching as police, in gloves and masks, confiscated his entire stock. He looked at the shelf where the bottles had sat. It looked perfectly normal. No signs of a break-in. No shattered glass. That was the horror of it. The killer hadn't broken the system. They had used it. They had walked in as a customer and walked out as a ghost. By sunrise, the streets of Chicago were littered with red and white bottles. They were in the gutters, in the trash heaps, floating in the sewers. But the toll wasn't finished. Because while the warning was going out, 3 more people were about to find out that they were too late. The warning came too late for Mary McFarland, a 31-year-old mother of 2 in Elmhurst. She had taken 2 Tylenol for a headache while at work at an Illinois Bell facility. She collapsed in the break room. Her coworkers thought she had fainted from exhaustion. They were wrong. It came too late for Mary Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant. She was found in her apartment, her suitcase still packed from a flight. On her kitchen counter, a bottle of Tylenol and a glass of water. She had just returned home to find relief. Instead, she found the vault. And perhaps most tragically, it came too late for Mary Reiner. She was 27 years old. She had just come home from the hospital after giving birth to her 4th child. She was tired. She was in pain. She took the medicine she trusted. She died in front of her newborn baby. 7 victims, all linked by a single brand. The investigation was no longer local. The FBI moved in. The FDA moved in. And in the boardroom of Johnson & Johnson in New Jersey, a group of executives sat in stunned silence as the phone lines lit up like a Christmas tree. They were facing the death of their company, but the world was facing something much worse. The realization that nowhere was safe. Not the store. Not the home. Not the cabinet. The invisible killer had succeeded. They had turned the American dream into a nightmare. We have uncovered the bodies. We have identified the poison. But the biggest question remains. Why? Who would do this? What kind of mind finds satisfaction in the random, agonizing death of a child and a new mother? In Section 3 of our investigation, we step into the boardroom. We look at the $100 million gamble that saved a corporation, but changed the way you buy everything, from milk to medicine. And we begin the hunt for the chameleon, the man who thought he could outsmart the FBI. The investigation is deepening. If you are still here, you are part of the Case Vault HQ elite. Subscribe now to ensure you are notified when Part 3 is unlocked. Like this video to honor the victims. Share this with anyone who takes their safety for granted. The files are waiting. Part 3: Corporate War and the Global Recall. While the sirens were screaming through the streets of Chicago, 800 miles away, in New Brunswick, New Jersey, the lights were burning late. At the headquarters of Johnson & Johnson. Imagine being James Burke, the CEO. You are at the helm of a company that is the gold standard of healthcare. Your most profitable product, Tylenol, is a household name. And suddenly, at 9:00 p.m. on a Wednesday night, you get a phone call that says your product is killing children in Illinois. This is the nightmare every executive fears. But for James Burke, it was worse. It was a total blackout of information. At first, the company thought it was a manufacturing error. They checked the batch numbers. They checked the plants. They thought maybe a vat of chemicals had been contaminated in Pennsylvania or Texas. But as the reports kept coming in, different batches, different stores, different towns, the terrifying truth became clear. Someone was hunting their customers. In the early 1980s, there was no crisis management playbook for this. Most companies, back then, would have stayed quiet. They would have hired lawyers, issued a vague statement, and waited for the news cycle to pass. But James Burke knew something. If he stayed quiet, the body count would keep climbing. He was facing a choice: save the brand's money, or save the brand's soul. He chose the soul. On September 30th, James Burke did something that had never been done in the history of American commerce. He didn't just recall the suspect batches in Chicago. He ordered a total nationwide recall of every single bottle of extra-strength Tylenol in existence. 31 million bottles. Think about the scale of that. Every pharmacy in California, every grocery store in Florida, every hospital in New York. Millions of people were told, bring your Tylenol back. We will give you a coupon for a safe replacement. The cost to the company was immediate: $100 million. In 1982 money, that is nearly $320 million today. But it wasn't just the money. It was the message. By pulling everything off the shelves, Johnson & Johnson was admitting their product was compromised. Critics at the time said the company was finished. They said the name Tylenol would forever be associated with the bitter almond scent of death. But Burke understood the American consumer. He knew that trust is built on transparency. He went on 60 Minutes. He did press conferences. He didn't hide behind a public relations firm. He looked directly into the cameras and said, "We will not put a single bottle back on a shelf until it is impossible for a human being to tamper with it." And while he was making that promise, the FBI and the FDA were realizing something else. The Tylenol killer had just created a blueprint. The Tylenol murders didn't just create fear. They created a blueprint for the deranged. Within weeks of the Chicago deaths, the FDA reported over 270 copycat incidents across the country. People were finding needles in candy bars, hydrochloric acid in eye drops, rat poison in mouthwash. The shelf tamperer had shown the world A new way to hold a society hostage. America was gripped by a collective hysteria. Parents stopped letting their children eat Halloween candy. People would inspect the caps of their milk jugs with magnifying glasses. The very act of shopping became a high-stakes psychological battle. The FDA realized that the two-piece gelatin capsule, the very thing that made Tylenol so easy to swallow, was the Achilles heel of the entire pharmaceutical industry. You could pull them apart and put them back together in 5 seconds. The world was demanding a solution, and it had to be a physical one. In the wake of the Tylenol murders, an entire industry was forced to evolve overnight. Johnson & Johnson didn't just bring Tylenol back. They reinvented how products reach your home. Within months, they introduced a 3-layer, tamper-resistant system, a glued box, a plastic neck seal, and a foil seal over the mouth of the bottle. For the first time, a consumer could look at a product and know immediately if it had been compromised. This wasn't just a redesign. It was a new language of trust. The FDA moved quickly. New federal laws were passed. Tamper-evident packaging became mandatory for over-the-counter medications. And soon, it spread to everything. Your bottle of water, your jar of peanut butter, your carton of milk. That little crack you hear when you open something new, that resistance in the seal, that moment of confirmation that no one has touched this before you, that exists because of the Tylenol murders. A killer changed the way the entire world consumes products. But while corporations were rebuilding trust and the government was rewriting regulations, the question still remained: who did this? Part 4: The Chameleon. For weeks, the investigation had been chasing a ghost. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, no surveillance footage, just 7 bodies and a trail of poisoned capsules. But eventually, the silence broke, not with a confession, but with a letter. On October 1st, 1982, the headquarters of Johnson & Johnson received an envelope. Inside was a typed message. It read, "Gentlemen, as you can see, it is easy to place cyanide into capsules sitting on store shelves. And since the cyanide is inside the capsules, it is easy to get buyers to swallow the poison. If you don't mind the publicity of these little capsules, then do nothing. So far, I have spent less than $50, and it takes me less than 10 minutes per bottle. If you want to stop the killing, then wire $1 million to bank account number." The letter was signed, "Yours truly, the Tylenol killer." The media exploded. The case had a voice now, a mind. And that mind was calculating, cold, and terrifyingly confident. The FBI immediately took over the extortion case. They analyzed the letter, the phrasing, the structure, the arrogance. This wasn't just a killer. This was someone who wanted recognition. Someone who believed they were smarter than everyone else. A chameleon. Someone who could blend into any environment. Someone who could walk into a store, place a bottle on a shelf, and disappear into the crowd. But the killer had made a mistake. And the FBI was about to follow the thread. The letter led investigators to a man named James William Lewis. He was 36 years old, a former accountant. But that title barely scratched the surface. Lewis was a drifter, a man who moved from state to state, job to job, identity to identity. He had a history of deception. In 1978, he was charged with the murder of a man named Raymond West, a case involving a dismembered body and a fraudulent insurance claim. The charges were eventually dropped, but the pattern was clear. This was a man comfortable with darkness. When the FBI searched his apartment, they found something chilling: a draft of the Tylenol letter. Not a copy, a draft. With corrections, edits, thoughts refined before being sent. It was enough to bring him in. Lewis was arrested and charged with extortion. But here's the twist. He wasn't charged with murder because there was no evidence placing him in Chicago at the time of the poisonings. No fingerprints on the bottles. No witnesses placing him in the stores. Nothing. During interrogation, Lewis was calm, almost amused. He admitted to writing the letter, but he claimed he was simply trying to profit from a crime he didn't commit. He said he saw the news and decided to insert himself into the story, to play the villain. The FBI wasn't convinced, but they couldn't prove otherwise. And so, the man who called himself the Tylenol killer walked away with a prison sentence for extortion, not murder. To this day, the Tylenol murders remain officially unsolved. James Lewis served his time for extortion, but he was never convicted of the killings. And he always maintained his innocence. Over the decades, investigators revisited the case. They re-examined the evidence. They followed new leads. They even tested DNA on the remaining bottles. But the results were inconclusive. The killer vanished as silently as they arrived. No motive, no closure, just a question that still lingers in the back of the American mind. Who did this? Was it Lewis? A man playing a deeper game than anyone could prove? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone who watched as an innocent man became the face of their crime? We may never know. But what we do know is this: 7 people lost their lives to an invisible enemy. And in doing so, they changed the world forever. Every time you twist open a bottle and hear that seal crack, every time you pause just for a second to check that it hasn't been tampered with, you are participating in a ritual born from tragedy, a silent acknowledgement of a crime that was never solved. The case vault remains open. Somewhere, the truth still waits.